Okay, good afternoon, everybody. It's Matt Horn of the Pembina Institute here. Thank you very much for joining. We're gonna get started, and we'll have some people join as we go. But we wanted to get underway for everyone that is online already. So yeah, welcome to the second in our series of Climate Leadership Plan webinars. Today we're going to be talking about methane and managing methane in BC's natural gas sector. Just to start off, I wanted to thank our sponsors for the webinar series, the Real Estate Foundation of British Columbia, the Sitka Foundation, Van City, and also the McLean Foundation. So thank you very much for helping to make this possible. So we're joined, well, I'll be kicking us off today. I'm the Associate BC Director for the Pembina Institute, joined by four excellent guests to sort of help us through this topic. David Keane, who's the president of the BC LNG Alliance, and along with myself, was also on the province's climate leadership team to provide advice to the province on next steps in its climate plan. Drew Nelson from EDF in the US, he's a senior manager for natural gas. EDF is doing a ton of great work on methane from the oil and gas sector, both in the US and globally. And also from Pembina, Chris Severson-Baker, our Alberta director, who's been actively involved in the development of Alberta's climate change plan. So, let's see here. Okay, so to start us off, just in terms of an outline, already covered off the intros, so we're through that. I'm going to provide just a bit of an overview of methane and just sort of its importance in the BC context. I'll turn it over to David Keane from the LNG Alliance. He's going to essentially just build on that sort of first intro, provide some of his perspective on sort of the opportunity around methane in particular, and the climate leadership team recommendations to address it in the province. Then we'll turn it over to Drew Nelson, who's going to be talking a little bit about some of the work they've done on methane reduction potential, and also providing some U.S. perspective on the issue, in particular where we're seeing some interesting progress from the federal government and at a state level in the U.S. And finally, we'll turn it over to Chris to share some of the Alberta perspectives and some of the really interesting and exciting movement. Well, I think the movement has been on climate generally in Alberta, but specifically on methane for the purposes of this webinar. That should take us sort of 20 or 25 minutes in total, and then we'll turn it over to the audience for questions and answers, and my colleague Max here will sort of help moderate us through that. So just to start us off, sort of why focus on methane for a webinar? It's sort of one piece in what will hopefully be sort of a broader, ambitious climate plan in the province. Based on sort of a few points in terms of why we're focusing on it for this piece, we know based on the current numbers, it represents about 15% of BC's oil and gas sector, which is predominantly natural gas production. Definitely some concern out there that that number is underreported. We know that the global warming potential for methane is higher than what's in the sort of the official numbers right now, and also I think a general concern that the actual volumes of methane are higher than what's currently being reported by not a BC specific thing, but sort of looking at that issue nationally. There's definitely a risk of those numbers across the natural gas sector increasing if LNG development proceeds in the province, so we need to make sure those emissions are restrained. It's also a gap in the province's climate framework. So we have the Climate Action Plan from 2008, which includes a number of, I think, really important pieces of the foundation for the province's climate plan. Currently, there is not policy there to address methane from the oil and gas sector, which does put the province in a lagging position relative to some of the jurisdictions like Colorado or the US EPA or Alberta, which have been moving ahead on the issue. And the last piece, just in terms of why it's important, it's when you look at sort of the scan of opportunities to reduce emissions, methane is one of the lowest cost and most affordable ones out there. So if we're going to build an effective climate strategy, it's really important that we are moving on that piece. So as I mentioned, the methane from the natural gas sector is a gap in the province's current climate change framework. So it was sort of an important part of the deliberations of the climate leadership team. So that was a panel that was struck last April by the Premier to look at produce recommendations for the province on how to take the next steps in its climate plan. And so given there was sort of a gap there, it becomes an important part of those deliberations. So I'm going to just quickly summarize the recommendations, not the full package of recommendations, but the recommendations specifically relevant for methane. So the first is this idea of setting a goal to reduce methane by 40% within 5 years. So that's just that's the target of the direction of where the province would be trying to remove emissions from methane in the oil and gas sector. That would put it in line with targets adopted by the US EPA, adopted by Alberta as well. There's different numbers and different timeframes, but definitely I'd argue it's in line with the ambitions of those other programs. The second piece in the near term would be implement best practices regulations for both leak detection and repair of those leaks for methane. So this was one that the team decided that there really is some low-hanging fruit there and some very cost-effective opportunities that aren't being captured right now. So to make sure we are sort of across the sector and for all operators using best practices to find where leaks are happening and making sure those leaks of methane are stopped. And I think this is one where there's varied practice right now. Some operators are quite good, and there's a range of practices. We know some are not sort of at those best practices, so making sure there's regulations to pick up on those low-hanging fruit opportunities. The third was sort of the first piece of, or the second piece of moving towards that goal of a 40% reduction, and modeled after, I think, successful efforts like in Colorado or Pennsylvania, or potentially what's unfolding now in Alberta as well, to develop this multi-stakeholder process, to develop both best practices for methane reduction and reporting, and also to figure out, as you sort of move through that process, what the backstop is going to be to ensure that those opportunities are taken advantage of. The last piece here is sort of at the way the climate leadership team recommendations were structured was sort of in 5-year chunks. So a number of sort of pieces that we were recommending the province move on immediately, which would sort of, I think, fit into these first 3 bullets. And then as we work through those, in general, sort of a 5-year check-in or review for the climate plan, specific to methane, what was proposed in there was setting a new reduction goal. So after we've achieved that 40% reduction, through that process, you're also going to be identifying new opportunities. So how much further can you go in the next 5-year period? So that would be part of it. The second part, and this is one I think it's an interesting space for sure, is that what is the regulatory mechanism or the pricing mechanism that's going to back up that voluntary goal? And there was a recommendation for near-term regulations on leak detection and repair, and I think generally an agreement across the team that you're going to need more than that. You can't just have a goal. You're not going to be successful with just a goal. You need government policy to encourage and incent the achievement of that goal. The default recommendation, or the preferred approach of the climate leadership team, was to expand the carbon tax so that it does apply to methane. It's an instrument that has been working both economically and environmentally for the province. Doesn't currently apply to methane emissions and other non-combustion sources. But the recommendation was sort of as a default approach to broaden that so you have that incentive on methane emissions as well. I think a recognition on the team that it's sort of an evolving space and a number of sort of different regulatory approaches emerging both from a state level and federally. So including sort of both the option of pursuing a regulatory approach. And I think the last one here is in the event that the sector is wildly successful in achieving that target in a largely voluntary approach, and openness to continuing that. I think fair to say there's some skepticism that it's going to happen, but in the event that it does, an openness to continuing that. So that's what I was going to provide sort of in terms of a kickoff in terms of the importance of methane, and a quick summary of the climate leadership team recommendation. So now I will turn it over to David Keane, and David, just interested in you sort of elaborating on that, just in terms of some of the discussions on methane, some of your perspective on the recommendations and where the province can move going forward.
Okay, Matt, thank you very much. I do want to say that as a member of the climate leadership team, it was important that really all of us agreed on the recommendations that were made. There was only one exception, and that was recommendation number 5, which was a an increase of the carbon tax in 2018, and probably no surprise to those on the phone, I was the one that sort of increasing carbon tax. And it wasn't because industry does not support pricing carbon. And clearly, we have a $30 per ton on carbon earned today in British Columbia. Nor do we potentially have a problem with a on carbon going forward. It was really about how we manage emissions-intensive and trade-exposed industries, and so we recognize that there's an issue there. And I should say that everyone that was on the climate leadership team was supportive of making sure that we, in fact, protect emissions-intensive and trade-exposed industries. So there was, I think, 100% unanimity on all of the recommendations, with the exception of recommendation 5, which was the increase in the tax. And there is, as Matt has pointed out, there is a goal of reducing methane emissions in the upstream natural gas sector by 40% in 5 years. And today we're having a number of discussions as the industry, and they're doing this on a sectoral basis with the British Columbian government in terms of what does this particular recommendation mean? How are we going to implement this particular recommendation? Is it achievable in 5 years or not? And those are ongoing discussions today. But again, everyone that I'm aware of that have been part of these discussions recognize that methane plays a significant role in climate change, and we also recognize that we have to reduce the amount of fugitive emissions that we're seeing. I do want to say that the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers back in 2007 issued their best management practices around managing methane and fugitive emissions, and they did a survey of in 2014 that showed a significant reduction in methane emissions and fugitives in particular over the 7-year period from 2007 through 2014. So the companies recognize that there is an issue, and they're working hard to make sure that they do reduce fugitive emissions. And we'll cover areas that he'll view as and I think he's right, as low-hanging fruit that can be captured by the upstream sector, and we're again working quite hard to do that. I would be remiss, though, if I didn't point out that in doing this, we have to be careful that, as the climate leadership team noted, we have to be careful that we protect emissions-intensive and trade-exposed industries. When you look at British Columbia, according to the British Columbia Business Council, our greenhouse gas emissions in BC account for about 0.02% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And so I think we can have a greater impact on reducing overall emissions. I know we're talking about methane, but overall emissions by producing natural gas in British Columbia by British Columbians and putting it on a pipeline that's operated by British Columbians and then shipped to the Asian markets to replace coal-fired power generation. There have been a number of studies done, one by the National Energy Technology Laboratory in the U.S. that shows there is a roughly 40 to 45% decrease in life cycle greenhouse gas emissions by replacing coal-fired power generation with natural gas. So I think that's something that we need to keep in mind as we're doing all of this. But again, I don't want to take away from the fact that the industry recognizes that methane plays a significant role, and the industry is in fact working quite hard to make sure that they are in fact reducing methane emissions that are achievable and that can be audited. And going back to Matt's point earlier, we recognize that this, while it's voluntary today, that if we're not successful at accomplishing an objective that's going to be set by the government, then the next step would be regulation. So I hope that covers what you were looking for, Matt.
Yeah, thanks a lot, David. That's helpful. And I just add a tiny bit of context before I turn it over to Drew. I think your comments on the emissions-intensive, trade-exposed sectors, I think, are reflective of where the team landed. I can't remember the exact language, but essentially language along the lines of that if the team did not want to see climate policy result in economic activity move from BC to elsewhere. And I think it's fair to say that the team also decided that it was possible to move ahead with climate policy and prevent that outcome, which is sort of, I think, where we landed as a package of recommendations. Probably one distinction, I know there's a debate around sort of the international context and sort of the role of natural gas, and it's totally fair in terms of sharing the perspective you did. We want to distinguish that that issue in terms of what LNG means in sort of a global context wasn't addressed as part of the climate leadership team recommendations. So one we did wrestle with a little bit, but ended up focusing more on the pieces that were essentially central to our mandate. So I think there's a bunch that we can sort of come back to in question and answer, but before that, I want to make sure we hear from both Drew and Chris. So I'm going to turn it over to Drew Nelson now from EDF, and so go ahead, Drew, in terms of some of the U.S. context.
All right. Thanks, Matt, and thanks for the opportunity to present today. I'm just going to start here just really briefly. Some of you may recognize this image on the screen. It's an infrared image from the Aliso Canyon methane leak in Southern California, which has been described as the worst environmental disaster since the BP oil spill several years ago. And it was invisible unless you were looking for it through infrared cameras, which is what we did here, and it was one of the biggest leaks, if not the biggest leak ever measured. Methane matters because it is such a potent greenhouse gas. Over a 20-year time frame, it is 84 times more potent than carbon dioxide. And in a world where we seem to be breaking temperature records on an annual basis, anything we can do to reduce the warming that we're feeling is important. And methane reductions can be a really important complement to reductions in carbon dioxide. Methane is 25% of the warming that we're feeling today, according to data from the IPCC. And the oil and gas sector is the largest industrial source of those emissions. So on the next slide, you can see that this is a cost analysis that we commissioned and along with Pembina to see, okay, well, methane is an opportunity. Methane from the oil and gas sector is an opportunity to reduce emissions, but how expensive is it? And what you can see, the analysis looked at the cost of those reductions across Canada and in Alberta and BC. And what you can see is that these reductions are actually quite cost effective. And that the green bars are actions that pay for themselves pretty quickly. The blue bars are ones that are somewhat cost effective but don't necessarily pay for themselves. But if you average them all out, you get a cost of $1.69 per ton of carbon dioxide equivalent, and that gets you about a 40% reduction of oil and gas methane emissions in British Columbia. So these are incredibly cost effective, and because of methane's potency, offer a real and important potential solution to solve the climate issue. You're not going to resolve global warming in and of itself by reducing methane, but the analysis that we've done suggests that if there was a global 45% reduction of oil and gas methane, that would be equivalent to closing 1,000 coal-fired power plants. So a really big potential here for reductions. The good news as it pertains to British Columbia is that you can get close to 90% of those reductions in British Columbia just through three policies. The first one is that blue block on the top right, where if you reduce fugitive emissions from gathering and boosting stations. The orange one gets you another close to 30% if you reduce vented emissions from things like blowdowns, and pneumatic devices, et cetera, et cetera. And then the gray chunk, that's about 26%, is leak detection and repair to reduce other fugitives outside the gathering and boosting section. So you can set up a policy framework in British Columbia that just with those three policies can get you 90% of those reductions, which is a pretty big deal. And importantly, these are technologies, these are policies that exist. You don't have to wait for a magic bullet solution. The companies are using these technologies across the world. The problem is they're just not using them everywhere that they should be. But there is experience with these technologies, and with regard to what the policy solutions to these emissions look like, there is a growing group of jurisdictions here in the United States, and then now with Alberta and Canada, that are beginning to develop what these regulations look like, and in some cases implement these regulations, so that jurisdictions like British Columbia and hopefully those that follow soon thereafter don't have to reinvent the wheel each time. There will be hopefully a growing pool of policies to follow that allow for people to get some of these immediate reductions from methane. So this next slide is a list of the top 10 gas producers by production in North America. You can see where they are ranked in terms of their production, and then the last column is are there regulations that have either been implemented or proposed in those jurisdictions. So just a couple of important caveats here. So going down that list, Pennsylvania, Alberta, which Matt will talk about, or sorry, Chris will talk about here in a second, Wyoming, Colorado, have all developed state-specific oil and gas VOC or methane regulations that have led to significant, or will lead to significant reductions from emissions in those states. And additionally, at the bottom of the list there in New Mexico, most of the drilling in New Mexico is on land owned by the federal government or by tribal governments. I guess it's the U.S. equivalent of Crown land. And the Bureau of Land Management, which manages that land, just proposed regulations on that land, which will significantly drive down emissions in New Mexico and other places where that activity takes place. So that leaves Arkansas, Oklahoma, Louisiana, and Texas as jurisdictions that don't have state-level action or federal-level action on tribal lands and federal lands, and that's where the EPA, U.S. Environmental Protection Agency regulations start to become very important. Back in January of last year, the Obama administration announced that the U.S. had a 40 to 45% oil and gas methane reduction goal by 2025, based on 2012 as a base year. And EPA, the BLM regulations I just talked about, are designed to help meet that goal, as are recent EPA regulations, which for the first time ever, the EPA has proposed directly regulating methane from the oil and gas sector. Those regulations have been proposed and are out for comment and review, and include standards for new, modified, and reconstructed equipment, and a variety of categories, including well completions, pneumatic pumps, fugitive emissions from well sites and compressor stations, seal emissions from compressors used in transmission and storage. And I can get into a little bit more detail on this later on, but there's also control technique guidelines to help meet ozone standards, but don't want to get into the details of that right now, because that's a whole another wonky conversation that could go for hours if needed. So with that, I'll wrap up and turn it back over to Matt, and looking forward to answering any questions that you might have. But in conclusion, there's a lot of knowledge and experience in reducing these emissions in the U.S., and Canada can tweak it and move forward on its own. And BC, following Alberta's lead, can hopefully take these regulations and make them even better.
Thanks a lot, Drew. So yeah, I'll just quickly turn it over to Chris here to just give our last panel part of the presentation, and yeah, just to share a bit of perspective on what has recently happened in Alberta when it comes to methane.
Okay, thank you, Matt. So I'm sure most people on this call took note of the Premier's announcement in November of 2015. The picture on the stage, or picture that's on the screen, shows the Premier with the representatives from 4 oil sands companies and 5 environmental organizations and representative of the First Nations. It was quite significant because, of course, we had gone from being a jurisdiction with sorry, I just want to make sure people can hear me because I'm hearing an echo. Matt, is it okay to proceed?
Yeah, we're getting a bit of an echo. We can see if we can clear that up, but I can hear you fine. So go ahead, Chris.
Okay. It was, after years of conflict, this government was able to put on the table a comprehensive climate plan that took into account the interests of folks in the oil and gas industry and the NGOs, and that's what helped result in that the visual that you're seeing there. Methane was, and the opportunities to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the upstream oil and gas industry was put on the table early on in the public process. It was recognized by environmental organizations and industry alike as sort of where the low-hanging fruit resided in terms of emission reductions from upstream oil and gas. And they were sources of emissions that were not being captured under the province's previous climate change system. So now, we're into 2016. The government is in the process of setting up a new climate change office because it recognizes that it has handed its bureaucrats a huge workload. Not only are there regulations pertaining to upstream oil and gas, but the policy included a coal phase-out, scale up of renewables, comprehensive energy efficiency program, and so forth. And so things are a little bit slow to get going as a result because there's just so many climate change policy pieces that are all moving forward simultaneously. So a new climate change office is being set up. It will report to a new deputy minister, who's actually the Deputy Minister Weary, who was the Deputy Minister of Environment, and they're in the process of staffing up. Everybody's waiting to find out exactly how the process will unfold from here, but what we expect, based on conversations we've had with folks in government and industry, is that the Alberta Energy Regulator will take the lead on developing the package for methane for the upstream oil and gas industry. And folks from Alberta Energy and folks from Alberta Environment and Parks will participate in that AER-led process. They intend to engage environmental organizations as well as industry and First Nations in their process. As it indicates on the slide, they have committed to developing standards that would come into effect in 2020, but they want to provide the first 5 years as a sort of a flexible period for voluntary action, which may include making some offset available under the system, but the details haven't yet been developed or announced. So there's a strong incentive, I think, on the part of all of the stakeholders in Alberta to move as quickly as possible to getting clarity on what that final backstop looks like, so that industry has certainty and it has as much time as possible to comply. And some of the other key things that I think that group led by the AER will need to focus on is being very clear about what the reporting and verification system will look like, so that Alberta can report out on how it's doing, the progress that it's making to Albertans. and to others, international organizations who publicly supported the Premier when she made the announcement in November. And there'll also need to be some work done on making sure that the quality of the data is solid. There's a lot of concern that either the data is maybe underreporting or may not be complete, and in order for the system to work, we think that it's going to be necessary to make sure that everybody has confidence in the data. Happy to answer any questions.
Thanks a lot, Chris. So that wraps up the panel part. I'm just going to sum up a couple things here before I turn it over to Max to moderate our question and answer session. But yeah, so again, thank you to the panelists for just providing that overview. Again, I think summing up the current status when it comes to methane, we do have a gap in the province's current climate policy framework. There's definitely a big opportunity, both from a cost effectiveness perspective and also in terms of thinking a little bit more broadly, BC contributing to I think what is emerging as a North American, hopefully a global success story on getting methane emissions down. So a couple sort of links here just to sort of learn a bit more and engage. So the BC government is currently sort of in the midst to about halfway through its second consultation period on the climate leadership plan. So definitely encouraging everyone to engage in that process, and hopefully encouraging the province to move ahead on an ambitious climate leadership plan. There is we put together with sort of a short summary of the climate leadership team recommendations. There's also sort of references there to the full package of recommendations if you're interested in reviewing those. This is the second in a series of 4 climate leadership plan webinar we're running. So the web address is there if you're interested in signing up for the third and fourth. The third is looking at the carbon tax specifically and some developer and local government perspectives on the climate leadership team recommendations and next steps in the carbon tax. And the fourth one is looking specifically at this issue of carbon tax and competitiveness. What do next steps mean for the economy as a whole, and how do we manage concerns specifically around emissions-intensive trade-exposed sectors? So hopefully be able to join us for those. And then we've actually just finished our own submission on the climate leadership plan that's available at the address listed there. So yeah, I'm going to turn it over to Max to give a quick explanation of the question process so you can enter those, and then he'll start picking them, and we'll hopefully be able to provide some useful answers to folks.
Thank you, Matt. So yes, we're going to be starting our Q&A now. So you should all have a question box in the control panel. So please just type in your questions there. That's much easier. That's which worked much better in the past than raising your hand. So if you have done this before, so yeah, please just type your questions into the little control panel box, and we'll get to them as much as we can. So the first question is coming in from John Waring, and it is the Pembina Institute engaged with discussions with the BC Oil and Gas Commission on methane reductions? And I will ask this, I'll ask Matt to take a first stab at this question.
Thanks for the question, John. So I guess in general, yeah, we've been engaged with the BC Oil and Gas Commission on issues around methane and more broadly with emissions from the natural gas sector. So we developed the BC Shale Scenario Tool last year, which is a publicly available tool that lets people look at what different levels of LNG development might mean for emissions in BC, in particular what it might mean under different sort of technologies and practices being used to limit emissions. So that was developed with a lot of input from the Oil and Gas Commission. On this issue, specifically around this, I think most of the engagement is still with the BC government in terms of setting the policy direction. I think my own sense is there's a lot of appetite within the Oil and Gas Commission to move ahead on this, but they would, as a regulator, would be taking direction from the BC government. So until there's a decision to move ahead on the climate leadership plan and which policies will specifically be in there, limited scope for the Oil and Gas Commission to take that on until they're given a direction policy-wise by the government.
Thank you, Matt, for this. Our second question is from Jamie Bonham, and is, can someone speak to whether the profile of methane emissions in Alberta is different than in BC? For example, I believe there are some substantial emissions in BC that are associated with heavy oil operations. I would ask Chris to take a first stab at this question. Chris, if you're on the line still.
Yeah, and I think Drew might have something to add on this one as well. I'm not as familiar with the profile in BC, and certainly the composition of the industry in Alberta looks very different. The analysis, the work that we did with ICF and with Environmental Defense found there was a similar marginal abatement cost curve for the different sources for Alberta, but it wasn't the same. You know, there's a high proportion of certain kinds of sources and that sort of thing in Alberta, as you would expect, because Alberta has a larger oil industry, a larger heavy oil industry. So it does look a bit different, but maybe Drew, did you want to add anything to that?
The only thing that I would add is that the report found it was actually cheaper to get oil and gas methane reductions in British Columbia than it was in Alberta. So that to me suggests that if Alberta is willing to move forward with a 45% goal, even though it was a bit more expensive than BC, it's all the more reason for BC to do something similarly.
Great, thank you very much. And I should also mention that we're going to be running 2 polls. So I'm going to ask Stephen to bring up the first poll now, and then if you could take a second and answer it. And while you do that, we'll get to our next question, and it is from Andy, and it is, BC's official methane emissions from oil and gas are 68 kilotons. This is about 0.23% of methane production, far lower than anywhere else in North America. The Pembina EDF report assumes 248 kiloton baseline. The EPA assumes an average fugitive release rate of 1.5%, though they vary. How can we manage methane reductions in BC when we have such doubt about the baseline? And once again, I'll ask Matt to take a first stab at this question.
Thanks for the question, Andy. And yeah, I'll give a shot at this, and other panelists may have that as well. So I think it's most people I talk to, there is it seems to be an agreement that methane emissions in BC and in Canada more generally are being underreported. 2 reasons for that. One, I guess the formal global warming potential still being used in the inventories is lower than what the IPCC guidance says. So that on its own will take the numbers up. The second piece being the sense that we're not, we don't have the right number in terms of the volume of methane coming off the sector. And so yeah, the number that was cited in the question, that's at a 0.2 or 0.25% leakage rate, is accurate. So there's nothing, I think, there's nothing different than BC is doing. Those are factors that are for the most part coming from Environment Canada's work. So the same challenges are going to exist across Canada. So to go back to, for example, the first sort of chart I had showed in terms of methane being responsible for 15% of BC's oil and gas emissions. If you factor in the higher global warming potential and say the leakage rate was 1% instead of 0.25%, that number goes from 15% to 50%. So definitely a material difference in terms of how important it is. One thing that's not in the climate leadership team recommendations, and I think this is, my own sense this is an oversight as opposed to something that there was disagreement around, but this idea of sort of making sure we're doing more work to better measure and understand methane emissions. And the province did do a study on pneumatic devices a couple of years ago that I think provided some good information, and there's certainly scope to do more of that to get a better handle on it, because really in terms of knowing how big they are in total and where the biggest sources are, the better information we have, the better we're able to inform the province's policies and the strategies. So I think there's a lot of scope there for improvement. I don't think that's a reason to delay in moving ahead. I think you do those in complement. So there are regulations that we can get in place now around leak detection and repair that I think are helpful regardless. We don't have maybe the perfect picture as to how much we're going to help, but absolutely we should be moving ahead on them. So that's what I would anyways. Dave, did you have maybe to sort of see if other panelists have anything they wanted to add to that?
Matt, this is Drew. If I could jump in, unless others want to do so before.
Go ahead, Drew.
So just a couple of quick observations. One, here in the U.S. context, there's been a number of studies recently which have shown that measured methane emissions are actually quite higher than what the U.S. EPA inventory would suggest, and that ranges to about anywhere from 50% higher to almost, there was one that I think that was around 95% higher. So multiple studies using multiple different methods are coming to that conclusion. And interestingly, the EPA, U.S. EPA just put out a draft of the new greenhouse gas inventory and revised the oil and gas methane emissions up based in part on what they say is new science showing that the inventories might be underreporting emissions. And so I think this is an issue across the globe in terms of what are the actual emissions, and part of the reason why doing additional measurements and studies is so incredibly important, and part of what we've been doing here in the U.S. context. But I'd also very much agree with Matt that that doesn't preclude from moving forward. You could if the U.S. experience holds true in BC, then the inventory is actually probably underreporting emissions. But there are ways that you could ground truth that relatively quickly and relatively cost effectively by doing some overflights and things of that nature. And incidentally, there's an emerging body of science that suggests that a couple years ago there was a big difference between methane emissions estimated by flyovers versus bottom up component by component measurements. But that gap is starting to narrow as people better understand how these different things interact, and so you could get a pretty good estimate with an overflight. It would cost a fair amount of money, but not anything that would break the bank.
Thanks, Drew. Anything you wanted to add to that, David? Or
Matt, I agree with Drew. I think having good solid data is going to be critical to making sure that we manage emissions, particularly methane, correctly. And I think looking at leak detection and repairs and looking at some of the things that can be done to capture some of the low-hanging fruit. And again, part of what we're doing as the industry is working with the British Columbian government as they look to implement the 35 recommendations that were made by the climate leadership team. So the industry is in fact working with the government to try to come up with solutions to one, hit the goal that was set by the climate leadership team of the 40% reduction, and trying to find ways in which we can do that. And again, getting good solid data I think is going to be extremely important.
Thank you very much for those answers. And we also have the results in our first poll, and you can see them here. Generally, there's a support for the right level of ambition in the CLT recommendation, or that it's not ambitious enough. So that's an interesting insight from the panelists and from the attendees. Thank you very much for filling that out. Our next question is, how do the CAP best practices compare to what's happening in the US states that have best-in-class regulations? And I'm going to ask David to take a first step at that, if he can.
To make sure I clarify that I'm not speaking on behalf of CAP. But I know that CAP has been working with Environment and Climate Change Canada, and it goes back to, I think, the spring of last year, in which they're looking at regulations that are being implemented by the US EPA, and then looking at where the gaps are in Canada. So I know that CAP is working with Environment and Climate Change Canada to look at the gaps and then to find ways in which they can close the gaps.
Thank you for that, David. Our next question is, it is directed at Chris. Is Chris aware of whether there's any conversation in Alberta about credits offsets for companies that have already taken steps to reduce emissions or have built new facilities with better performance?
I'm not aware of that. If I understand the question correctly, that would be giving credit to companies that have taken action prior to the implementation of this new policy announcement. And I haven't heard anything about that. I know that that the process that the AR is going to implement is going to look at proposals, I think, to give credit for companies that take action before 2020, if there can be a verifiable offset created in or already exists. I don't think I'll give you sort of the Pembina perspective on offsets a little bit as it relates to methane. We're a little bit we're open to this as being a mechanism for companies to take early action. We're a little bit skeptical about the ability of the government to put in place offsets quickly enough to make it worth the while of industry to avail themselves of them. But we're open to being proven wrong on that point. There's an awful lot of work that needs to happen very quickly on climate policy implementation, and we just know from past work on offsets under the previous system that the development of those verifiable offsets is a pretty onerous process.
Thank you, Chris, for that. Our next question is from Brendan, and it is, if through better oversight of methane emissions, it is found that emissions are actually higher than the current greenhouse gas inventory estimates, how would this affect the 40% target? Is it 40% beyond a revised baseline or 40% below current inventory estimates? And I'm going to ask Matt to take a first stab at this question.
Thanks, Brendan. So I don't think the climate leadership team report speaks to that specific issue. So I just offer my own perspective on that. And so I think if the number ends up being bigger, to me that sort of points to sort of a higher importance of moving ahead on the sort of both the process and the policies to get the number down, particularly sort of with the possibility of LNG development and the associated increase in upstream activity. I don't know, I think I don't necessarily see a need to sort of change that that target, like the study that Drew referred to by ICF does have a higher number for methane in there than what's in the official inventory because of some of the expectations that the actuals are higher, and they're still finding quite a large potential to reduce emissions. So I wouldn't want to see a situation where we say, oh, the emissions from methane are higher, so we have to sort of scale back the target of the ambition. To me, that the evidence we do have on that front points to sort of there being quite a big opportunity, so we should be acting on it based on that information, and based on what we have, it points to sort of a pretty significant opportunity.
Thank you, Matt, for that. I'm And Stephen also just started the second poll, so please take just a second to fill this out. And our next question is on regarding the US EPA regulation, and it is, the US EPA regulations apply to new equipment only. How quickly will it become an effective regulation? And I will ask Drew to take a first step at this question.
Yeah, so that's a good question, and EDF is pushing the EPA very hard to try to move forward on a standard for existing sources as well. Unclear when that will happen. But I think it's important to note here that because a number of large producing states have moved forward with regulations on both new and existing, because the BLM proposal is for new and existing sources, it's not as though existing sources aren't covered in the U.S. at all. They're actually covered to quite a large extent. But there's still plenty of scope to include more of those existing sources if EPA were to do an existing source standard, which we believe is actually quite feasible. And if I could just rewind a couple of questions, there was a question about voluntary action, and I think it's worth flagging that the ICF analysis included an estimation of voluntary actions continuing into the future at the similar rate that they've had over the past couple of years. And even with those voluntary actions, still found that there's broad scope to get a significant amount of reductions across Canada, that 45% reduction. It's a similar experience here in the U.S. We've had voluntary programs here in the United States. That one of the first things that was recommended back in the 90s was to get rid of high bleed pneumatic devices. Yet there's still countless high bleed pneumatic devices here in the U.S. and from what I understand in Canada as well. So without a regulatory or financial incentive, it's very hard for us to imagine a situation in which a voluntary mechanism will yield the reductions necessary to achieve the goal.
Thank you for that, Drew. That's a very good answer. As you can see on your screen, we also have results for the second poll, and it is on how do you think BC should encourage reductions in methane emissions, and there is overwhelming support, 88%, that it should be through both a combination of a broadened carbon tax and through regulation. So that's a very interesting insight. Thank you for the attendees to filling that out. Our next question is from Mark, and it is, the BC Oil and Gas Commission has venting and flaring regulation. Is this not methane regulations by another name?
I can start with that, Max. Thanks. So it's a good question, and I think it is fair. So there is the Oil and Gas Commission does have regulations in place that I guess put a priority first on sort of conservation of gas. If that's sort of deemed not possible or demonstrated as being not feasible by an operator, the next step would be sort of requiring for flaring, and then if subsequently that's proven not to be feasible for some reason, they're allowed to vent as methane. So there is a piece in place, and you still find some practices globally that are worse than that. I think, as sort of shown by the ICF analysis, the work the province did a couple of years ago on pneumatic devices. With that in place, there's still a lot of opportunity to go further and finding additional opportunities to reduce methane across the supply chain, whether it's intentional or unintentional releases. So relative to where other jurisdictions have been pushing with some of their leading policies, definitely still a gap and an opportunity for BC to push further. Yeah, there's a fair point that in terms of there is a piece, sort of a starting point in place by the BC Oil and Gas Commission. Yeah, an opportunity to build upon, and lots of gap there still to fill.
Thank you, Matt, for that. Our next question is directed at Chris again, and it says, you mentioned in your presentation that we need to give industry as much time as possible to comply with new pending regulations. How much time is as much time as possible? Chris, if I could ask you to take a stab at this.
Yeah, so I guess the new requirements will come into place in 2020, such that the methane reduction goal will be met by 2025. Therefore, if the rules can be developed and clearly and become clear to industry stakeholders as soon as possible, then there'll be more time for industry to react and possibly to take advantage of some opportunities around offsets, as I mentioned before. So the clock is ticking right now on that 5-year window in which companies could take early action. So that's why I mentioned I think it creates a bit of an incentive. You know, I think everybody would like to move through the process of developing these requirements and get into the announcement stage as soon as possible.
Thank you, Chris, for that. That's good. Our next question is from Andy, and it is it even possible for BC to implement tougher regulations or carbon taxes on fugitive emissions, given the legislated assurance that the BC government has given to Petronas? And Petronas is the proponent behind the Pacific Northwest LNG project. And I'm going to ask David to take a first stab at this question.
I'm sorry, repeat the question again, Max.
Is it even possible for BC to implement tougher regulations or carbon taxes on fugitive emissions, given the legislated assurance that the BC government has given to Petronas?
Well, what the assurance that was given to Petronas, and again, I'm not speaking for Petronas, but in the project development agreement that was public information, where they're protected is from a sector increase in the carbon tax. So a discriminatory increase in the carbon tax wouldn't be permitted under what's been published by the government. However, having said that, if there is an economy-wide increase in the carbon tax, then everybody in British Columbia would be exposed to the increase of the carbon tax. So just because they've gotten assurances from the government under under the project development agreement, it simply says that they can't do something on a discriminatory basis, but if it's economy-wide, then it applies to everyone.
It's Matt here. I'll just add to that. So that's correct. That legislation does create some restrictions. It doesn't create any restrictions on an economy-wide carbon tax. And when it comes to the upstream side, as far as my interpretation of it, there wouldn't be any restrictions for stronger methane regulations on the upstream side for gas either. So there definitely are some restrictions, and from a Pembina perspective, not a huge fan of that agreement. But in terms of the scope of what we're talking about today, both in terms of increased or expanded carbon taxes or methane regulations in the upstream gas production, there's no restrictions imposed by that agreement.
Great, thank you, Matt. And we have time for one last question quickly, and that is, can a carbon tax really be a useful tool to manage methane emissions from sources that is inherently difficult to measure? And I will ask Drew to take a quick first stab at this question.
It might be better to have Matt do that because he can answer it much more robustly than I can. I would just flag one potential issue when you're talking about methane and a carbon price, and that is, methane and CO2 act very differently in the atmosphere. Methane much more in a short term, CO2 for a longer term. So if you're doing offsets between the two, or if there's a carbon price, there needs to be some sort of exchange rate, so to speak, that takes that behavior in the atmosphere into account. The traditional 100-year GWP, in my personal perspective, doesn't truly account for the impact that methane has on the atmosphere in the short term. And so I think a lot of thinking needs to be done on that front before more work on a carbon price for methane goes too far.
And
thanks, Drew. It's a good consideration around sort of the global warming potential in the different timeframes. So this is again in terms of the climate leadership team recommendations and the document itself. There's pretty clear agreement in there that the carbon tax and carbon pricing generally is sort of an effective piece of an overall climate strategy and should be an effective sort of a central piece of BC's plan. The consensus recommendation in there was the default approach would be to broaden the carbon tax, and I think some wiggle room there to sort of figure out if maybe there are better approaches as we sort of move forward. But as a starting point, given what we know in terms of how it's worked to date and what the data we do have on methane, seeing that as sort of the preferred or the default approach. And this is more from a Pembina perspective. The nice thing about it, if you've got it in place, whatever the emission source is, it encourages an operator to go all the way to zero, because the lower your emissions are, the less you pay, and there's sort of an economic incentive there. And sort of concerns around competitiveness, I think, are real, and the climate leadership team did attempt to address through the recommendations around emissions-intensive trade exposed sectors and how to address that. But on the carbon side of it, or the methane side of it, if you've got an incentive to go to zero, you're going to look as sort of a responsible operator in the case of the gas sector and see where there are opportunities to reduce methane, and it's in my economic interest to get all the way to zero if it's cost effective to do so. So we're at time, so I did want to wrap things up. Certainly feel free to follow up with ourselves or any of the panelists. Thank you very much for spending the last hour with us on this topic, and a lot of really good questions, and just a demonstration of good interest in the topic. Just to reiterate, that climate leadership plan consultation is underway, so please take a look, please engage in the process and let the government know where you're interested in seeing that process go. And just one last thank for the sponsors for this in terms of the Real Estate Foundation, the Sitka Foundation, Van City, and the McLean Foundation. And again, thanks to Drew, David, and Chris for making this an interesting hour. The Shine Foundation, sorry.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.